Hey guys, Arizona here, lead educator at Embodied Self-Defense. Today the topic is the most surprising lessons I learned from being a domestic abuse worker. So I work part-time in my day job as a domestic abuse worker, and I work primarily with LGBT plus people, non-binary people, and also men who are potentially experiencing domestic abuse. Now, acknowledging that a large percentage of perpetrators of violence in the world are men, although definitely not all, for sure. We have to, in terms of mitigating risk and upholding safety, we have to go through an assessment process when we intake any new service user. So we have to screen people for potentially being perpetrators, because we would never, ever, ever want to collude with a perpetrator and increase the risk either to someone's safety or increase the risk of homicide to a family or whatever it might be. So very, very, very important that we are careful about who we onboard. And when we're doing these assessments, we pull on many different strands of information from different sources. We don't take these decisions lightly, because obviously these decisions can have huge impacts on a family's life. So really, we take these decisions very carefully. We consider information from all different sources to kind of rest our final decision and conclusion as to whether we continue support. So what I have learned from this very, very, very interesting insight is two lessons. So number one is that this just really shocked me when I started to uncover this. So the first one is that very often perpetrators genuinely believe that they're the victim. Genuinely believe that they're the victim. Now, this is shocking, because my misconception about perpetrators previously was that every perpetrator knows that they're inherently evil. Every perpetrator knows exactly what they're doing. Every perpetrator knows what side of the coin they're on. But the reality is that is definitely not the case. Okay, sometimes, of course, there will be some perpetrators who are very manipulative and good at lying and know perfectly well what they're doing, but have a great cover story and tell it well. But I would say, in my subjective anecdotal experience, although I have been doing this for a number of years, I would say that by and large, most of the time, they genuinely do believe that they're the victim. And they believe that their perpetrator actions are vindicated because they are the victim. You know, so-and-so is not meeting my expectation, therefore I reacted and I was justified in my reaction. So let's just blow that myth apart that perpetrators always know that they're the perpetrator. Believe me when I say many, 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 many times they believe that they themselves are the victim. And we see that a lot. You know, there's a certain brand, there are different types of perpetrators. There are violently aggressive perpetrators. There are other kinds of perpetrators that they're the victim kind. You know, they're always the victim of something, and they might be more prone to making false accusations, things like that. So let's just bear in mind that just because somebody says they're a victim of something doesn't always necessarily mean that they are. And even though somebody totally believes that they are, if we look at the objective evidence, that might not be the case. Now, I tread very, very lightly when I say these things, because I don't want to enter the territory of invalidating people's stories of being abused and things like that. I mean, literally, you know, the perpetrator's responsibility is on themselves whether or not they perpetrate. It's not about, you know, they think that they're the victim, therefore their actions are justified and your story is somehow invalidated. I am not throwing up any questions right now about whether your story or somebody else's story is true or isn't. All I'm saying is, in my experience, someone labeling themselves as a victim when they're displaying perpetrator behaviors, such as being controlling or being quite verbally abusive, disrespecting boundaries, things like that, I'm saying that's a big red flag, okay? Just bear that in mind. And then the second really important, I mean, like, probably life-changing lesson actually that I learned from this job is that perpetrators don't always need to know what they're doing for it to be abuse, okay? Many times, you know, I mean, again, we have this misconception that perpetrators are all super evil people who know exactly what they're doing and they're just malevolent and awful, terrible human beings. And sure, there definitely are some that are like that. However, actually, a much larger percentage than you'd think of perpetrators are people who have had significant trauma experiences or struggling with mental health, certain life events, and they have very poor coping mechanisms. So that coping mechanism might be to verbally abuse you, might be to manipulate you, Maybe, for example, a person who has a very anxious attachment style. So they're really, really afraid of abandonment, super, super afraid of abandonment, almost traumatically afraid of abandonment. So they control, they manipulate, they emotionally blackmail because they're just trying to hold on to something. So again, that can become abusive behavior, and that's driven by a fear. It's not necessarily, I want to hurt you because I don't like you. And there are other examples as well. It could also be about a person's relational roadmap that they learned when they were young. Maybe within their family culture, abusive behaviors are normalized. Maybe within their family culture, boundaries just don't exist, So the important point about saying this is not in any way to remove responsibility from perpetrators, not in the slightest. No matter what your traumatic history is, no matter your state of mental health, no matter any of those things, you still are responsible for your actions, and you have a responsibility to become self-aware and do something about that to try and not harm others in such a significant way. So, just to be clear, we're not removing responsibility from perpetrators in any way, but the point of saying this is so that we can validate ourselves when we are experiencing abuse as a result of their behaviors. When we're emotionally distressed, when we are suffering, when we're physically harmed, emotionally harmed, psychologically harmed, whatever, I'm validating that just because that person doesn't know what they're doing, just because they're not self-aware, just because they're not doing it on purpose, doesn't mean that it's not abuse, okay? And when we label it as abuse, that empowers us to act on it, okay? It gives us the empowerment, that validation that we need to say, okay, this is unacceptable, because we have this thing in our mind how abusive behavior is only unacceptable when it's deliberate. But the truth is, it doesn't matter whether it's deliberate or not, it doesn't matter whether it's conscious or unconscious. We also have a responsibility to lay boundaries for ourselves and protect ourselves. We can't expect people who have a very poor relational roadmap to know how to do the right thing without guidance. And sometimes even with guidance, they're still not going to do the right thing. So they have a responsibility to stop perpetrating themselves, to stop displaying abusive behaviors, but we also have a responsibility ourselves to lay boundaries and validate when we're being abused and when we're being harmed, and say, okay, I'm going to do something about this. I am worthy of being treated correctly, so I'm going to take responsibility for myself and remove myself from this situation if possible, or use my words to try and help them grow their awareness, or lay a boundary, or whatever it is we need to do. Seek support, call the police if it's extreme, talk to friends, get support. There are many different options that are available to us. So again, I'm not victim blaming. I'm not saying that, if somebody who's unconscious about their abuse is abusing you and you don't do something about it, it's all your fault and you deserved it. Not in the slightest, not even remotely am I saying that. What instead I am saying is an empowering and validating message that just because somebody doesn't know what they're doing is abusive, or struggles to comprehend it, or maybe even has a coping mechanism where they just can't accept that they are doing that, because that would just tear everything apart and everything would fall apart for them, doesn't mean that we can't take action to protect ourselves. Doesn't mean that it's not that bad. Doesn't mean that we are not validated enough to do something about it, okay? Not validated enough to go and seek support if we're really struggling mentally, okay? So yeah, just really, really feel like that's an important lesson. It's massive because one last point, we think that these abusive people, these perpetrators are, mysterious strangers who are totally evil, awful people, and they just jump out of bushes and stuff. But the truth is, most of the abuse that we experience in our life is probably going to be by a person that we know, possibly even a friend, a family member, a partner, okay? Again, another layer to that. They might not even know what they're doing. They might not be conscious of it. They might not be aware of it. If you love them, sure, take that opportunity to try and grow their awareness. But that will work for some people. It's not going to work for others. And you've got to draw a line yourself at some point and say, enough is enough. I've tried my hardest to help you see the truth of your ways. I've tried to help you heal your emotional wounds and trauma. I've supported you. I've given you so much of my energy. And you aren't taking responsibility for yourself and your actions. You're not taking responsibility for your own recovery and healing. You're not taking responsibility for your own personal growth and improvement. So I'm going to draw a line. I'm going to set a boundary. I'm going to say enough's enough. I need to protect myself. So there we go. There's your daily dose of validation. And that's 2 lessons from me and my life as a domestic abuse worker.